So I think on that note, I actually want to turn now to the question of which voters both of the major political parties in the US are overlooking. Because building off of what you just said, I think that actually helps explain why right-wing populism springs up from time to time. And I also think that, looking at this question has important implications, obviously not just for the Democrats, but for the left as well. Who are we looking at? Who do we make appeals to? Who do we organize? So last year, two political scientists at Harvard, Peter Hall and Georgina Evans, they did a study where they basically showed that there is a pretty significant segment of the population whose economic views and cultural views are not reflected by the two major parties. So the first thing the researchers looked at was basically how the parties have changed since the 1980s. And this probably won't be, a huge shock to most Jacobin viewers, but for the last 40 years, the mainstream parties in Europe and in the US have been sort of converging on economic issues. So that means that in the US, the Democrats have actually been moving to the right on economics. I think the classic example of this is in the 90s, Bill Clinton deregulating the financial sector and completely gutting and dismantling welfare. And then, of course, the Republicans are already on the right economically. So, their economic views are looking more and more like each other's, at least more so than they did in, say, the 60s. But at the same time that the parties have been converging on economics, Hall and Evans, who are the authors of the study, also say that the parties have been growing more polarized on cultural issues. So they define those as issues like immigration, abortion, gay rights, race relations, and they argue that the major differences between the two parties today are kind of in that realm. And I think, if you watch MSNBC or Fox, you can see the sort of perpetual culture war on those issues being played out between the Democrats and the Republicans from time to time, over and over. So I think that rings true. So the second part of their argument is that at the same time that the political parties are sort of converging economically, what's actually happening in the electorate is that voters are moving to the left. And the reason this is happening is, of course, because over the last 4 decades, we've seen rising economic inequality, standards of living are declining, so people are moving to the left economically. So what we have now is essentially a block of voters who are in many ways to the left of the Democrats on economic issues. So I want to look at a chart now that I've kind of adapted from their study. So what we have here is they basically break down the political spectrum, but instead of looking at it as a matter of just left versus right, they also divide political preferences along 2 axes, as you can see. So one is economic and one is cultural. So if we're looking at this chart today, obviously Democrats are in the blue quadrant, and that kind of shows that they are to the right economically, but sort of culturally cosmopolitan, so like progressive culturally. Of course, Republicans are more traditional or more conservative culturally, but of course, right economically as well. And then I think, someone like AOC is in the green quadrant. That's somebody who is, very culturally progressive, but also has a kind of left Bernie Sanders style economic platform. Bernie Sanders is also in this quadrant, and I suspect that most readers of Jacobin and most members of the Democratic Socialists of America are also in this quadrant. But the quadrant I actually want to focus on is the yellow quadrant, which is people who are economically left, but more culturally conservative, or I guess more culturally traditional. And I think that this is an interesting quadrant to focus on because the authors of this study, Hall and Evans, they actually make the argument that a fifth of the population right now falls into that quadrant. And, I think when we think of somebody who's economically left, but culturally conservative, I think the stereotype that immediately comes to mind is like the Archie Bunker type voter, right? Like a blue collar white guy who's like maybe in the union, but like has some regressive views on gender and race. And, to be sure, there are probably some of those who fall into that category, but when you think about a fifth of the population, they're not everyone, right? So, Hall and Evans in their study, they find that the people in this quadrant are basically manual workers and low-wage service workers. Manual workers maybe sort of encompass the Archie Bunker type people, but low-wage service workers are, as we know, in the US, disproportionately Black and brown. So I want to like focus on that for just a second, because this description of economically left and, you know, culturally conservative, actually a lot of Black voters and a lot of immigrant voters fit this description. So I'm going to unpack this a little, because I know that this characterization like tends to make the left a little uncomfortable. So one example is when you look at the polling, we see that Black voters tend to support, you know, higher immigration restrictions. Often they express lower levels of support for gay marriage. And similarly, when you look at immigrants from Catholic backgrounds, so like Latinos and certain Asian groups like Filipinos and Vietnamese Americans, they often say that they oppose abortion or like gay marriage. And I think I recently saw somewhere that a majority of Asian American voters say that they don't support legalizing marijuana. So like, obviously, in some ways, these are like kind of conservative cultural views, right? But I think the key here, and this is really important, is that on the whole, none of these groups prioritize these cultural issues. So for example, you don't see Black voters casting ballots in droves for like nativist politicians, right? And you also see that the majority of Asian American voters and the majority of Latino voters say in polls that their top issues are things like healthcare, jobs, the economy, strengthening, you know, public services. And we also know that people who don't vote, so for example, just the non-voters, you know, as you said, Paul, the people who kind of dropped out of the electorate, they also prioritize bread and butter issues. We know this from the polls. They, you know, say that they support unions. They say that they want to raise the minimum wage. They want to increase government spending on public education and the social safety net. So, you know, to me, what this suggests here is that there's really an opportunity, right? Not just for the Democrats, but also for the left to appeal to this part of the electorate by foregrounding economic issues, by foregrounding a left economic agenda, or again, what we might call bread and butter issues. And, you know, to some extent, leaving some aspects of the culture war behind. And I just want to be really clear that, you know, in no way do I think that the left has to or should sacrifice or like walk back any positions on abortion or immigration or gay rights. But rather, the point is like, I think that this is an opportunity to make inroads with this slice of the population, because A, if these people are a fifth of the population, that's actually quite a lot of people. And B, I think we have a lot of evidence that a lot of these people are pretty movable on the cultural stuff, right? And they're actually going to respond to a strong economic agenda. So finally, I want to hammer home also that the Democrats just can't take anyone for granted. We've been talking about that throughout the duration of this episode. But I just don't think that the Democrats can wait for the demographics of this country to change over time. And to kind of illustrate that, I want to look at some results from a poll of low-wage workers. The polling firm Lake Research surveyed around 1,200 low-wage workers right before this year's election. So if we look at the first slide, we can see, this is from the poll, we can see that significant majorities of the workers polled look very left on economics, right? They favor stronger workers' rights. They want a $15 minimum wage. A majority says that they want Medicare for all. They seem very, the vast majority wants companies to offer paid leave and wants companies to set predictable work schedules. So that's like a very like kind of classic Bernie style platform. And we can see that low-wage workers are very, very supportive of that. But if we go to the next slide, this is from the same poll. We also see that the same workers actually say that they're pretty evenly divided between Biden and Trump. I mean, obviously, you can see here that Biden has 49% to Trump's 41%. So like they are leaning Biden a little bit. The split between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to congressional candidates is a little closer. And I think that's really interesting when you consider that with the last slide, because, I think the Democrats would say, well, we're obviously the party that has, the more progressive economic platform. So if these workers really want that, why aren't they getting on board with the Democrats? To me, again, I think that just shows that Democrats aren't doing a good job of convincing voters, right? And I think that we saw this actually in the recent election in the state of Florida, where a supermajority of voters in that state passed a $15 minimum wage ballot measure, but the state voted for Trump. So finally, I want to look at just one more piece of this survey of low-wage workers. At the end of the survey, respondents were asked to listen to a series of statements and say which one they found convincing. The first statement is a kind of Bernie-style, like economic populist statement. So I think that's slide 4. So respondents were presented with a statement which reads, America has a choice this year between two paths. One path keeps us going in the current direction. The top 1% of wage earners, the wealthiest, keep pulling ahead. Wall Street and corporate CEOs keep rigging the rules and the wage gap keeps growing. The other path is towards working people coming together and forcing politicians, CEOs, and Wall Street to listen to us. So it goes on, but as I say, this is clearly like a very like Bernie style, like against the 1%, workers band together kind of statement. And unsurprisingly, 67% of the respondents in the poll say that they find this statement very convincing. But to, I guess, circle back to something that Paul was talking about, there's another statement that the respondents were asked to evaluate, and it's this one here. So this is kind of more of a Trump style statement. So, and this one reads, our leaders must prioritize keeping us safe and ensuring that hardworking Americans have the freedom to prosper. Leaders who built a strong economy once can do it again after COVID-19. Taking a second look at China or illegal immigration from places overrun with drugs and criminal gangs is just common sense. And so is fully funding the police so our communities are not threatened by people who refuse to follow our laws. We need to make sure we take care of our own people first, especially the people who politicians have cast aside for too long to cater to whatever special interest groups yell the loudest or riot in the street. And, you know, I think to us, it kind of, the dog whistles in that statement are clear, right? Like I would not sign on to a statement like that. There's clearly sort of xenophobic immigrant baiting, the stuff about, you know, the rioting and police in the streets, I think is obviously a sort of classic right-wing call to law and order. But again, the same group of workers in the survey, 61% of them say that they find this statement convincing. So, you know, to me, I really feel like this just shows that there is a segment of the electorate right now that no political party is speaking to, right? And if the Democrats and the left don't take this seriously and look at this part of the population, we run the danger of creating a vacuum for someone like Trump or another right-wing figure who kind of pretends to be a populist to appeal to this group. So yes, again, going back to what Paul was saying, like there is an opportunity here, but it really seems like the Democrats are squandering it.
Yeah, that was really well said. And, you know, like, I mean, one way I kind of think about it is more like culturally moderate than conservative, you know, and it's like you said, the people who the cultural issues are not their main thing, but it's also not the major thing they're seeking to change in their lives, especially, or at least at this point. And, you know, a lot of this sometimes comes down to like the vibe of a candidate, like when they're opening their mouths, the first sentence that comes out of their mouth, like, does it seem like a candidate that vibes culturally
right, exactly.
with me or
yeah
not?
And I think, you know, again, on the kind of cultural issues, as you said, it's more like culturally moderate or kind of like culturally agnostic, I guess. And I think the other thing is like if we were to put forth a strong economic platform, or if the Democrats were to do that, I actually think that that's one way of getting more people on board to be amenable to those cultural issues. Right. So
yeah,
that's
I think the key word you used was what you foreground. And I think a great example is probably like Bernie in his years in Burlington, Vermont. So like think about that place culturally, you know, making his main issue gun control probably would not be the best thing, or like any sort of social issue. So he foregrounded the economics, but it doesn't mean abandoning. Like look at his voting record. He has a D- from the NRA. I'm sure if he went through every social issue, he would have an A+ voting record from the progressive stand of view. Yeah, I mean, it's like, what is the core of your message? Just recognizing in a strategic way what is going to appeal, you know, more immediately to people.